Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're exploring something fundamental. How children figure out the invisible rules of the social world. What's right, what's expected, and what's just, well, their own business. And crucially, how all of that is shaped by the culture they grow up in and the specific situations they find themselves in.
It's a fascinating topic, and we've pulled together a stack of sources that give us a really nuanced view. We're looking at research on how kids and young adults in the U.S. and Korea reason about gender norms,
Okay.
a study on what Korean mothers believe about teaching social skills, and some, excellent guidance from U.S. sources on raising ethical children and teaching social skills in schools.
Our mission for this deep dive is to connect the dots across these sources. We want to surface the most compelling insights into the interplay between culture, context, and a child's developing sense of social rules and ethics. Get ready for some genuinely surprising findings, I think. Okay, let's unpack this by first setting the stage. How do kids even begin to make sense of the rules around them? The sources introduce a really helpful framework called a social domain theory, which suggests that even from a young age, children start to distinguish between different kinds of rules.
That's right. They don't see all rules as equal. There are things they perceive as moral principles. These are about welfare, fairness, rights, things seen as inherently wrong, like causing harm.
Right.
Importantly, they judge these as wrong regardless of whether a rule exists or if an authority figure says it's okay.
So hitting someone is just wrong because it causes pain, not because a grown-up said no hitting. It's a universal sort of sense of right and wrong.
Exactly. Then you have social conventions. These are, they're kind of arbitrary rules that help coordinate social interaction within a specific group or culture. Think dress codes, manners, greetings.
Okay.
Authorities do have jurisdiction over these. They're dependent on context and agreement.
Okay, so conventions are more about, this is how we do things around here, to make things run smoothly. And they can change depending on where you are.
Precisely. And finally, there's the personal domain. These are matters of individual choice that are considered outside the realm of social regulation or authority. What music you listen to in your room, what you eat for lunch, within reason, of course.
Right. And the sources make a key point. Issues that might seem simple, like gender-related expectations, can actually touch upon all three domains depending on how they're framed. Is it about unfair treatment that's moral? Is it about following group expectations conventional? Or is it purely a matter of personal preference?
And how a child categorizes it influences how they think about enforcing that norm or, reacting to someone who breaks it. It really matters.
Now let's dive into one of our core sources, a fascinating study comparing children and young adults in the U.S. and Korea. It explores exactly how they think about violating gender norms.
Yeah, this research used hypothetical scenarios, presenting participants of different ages in both countries with stories. For example, a boy who likes to color princesses or a girl who enjoys building forts.
Okay.
They were asked what the child should do in two different settings. Alone in their room, so private, and during show and tell at school, which is public.
The study provides some essential context here. Korea has a more traditional background with stronger gender role expectations than the U.S., reflected in its Gender Development Index.
Right, and previous findings even suggested Korean children might be more accepting of gender norms. Yet the source also notes that Koreans value critical thinking about unfairness and accept defying norms for a moral reason, like helping someone. So it's not a simple traditional versus modern story, it's more complex.
Right, nuance is key. Okay, let's look at what they found. First, consider the private setting the child is alone in their room. What did participants think about them pursuing the atypical activity?
Okay, get this. In Korea, across all age groups, the response was overwhelmingly clear. The child should absolutely choose the preferred activity. It was seen as a personal choice. End of story.
Wow, really decisive. But in the U.S.?
There was an interesting age difference. Younger American kids, around 5 and 7 years old, were less flexible. They were more likely than older U.S. participants and the Korean participants to say the child should choose the gender-typical item, even when alone.
That's surprising, actually, especially given the usual narrative about cultural context. It suggests younger American kids might be internalizing those norms in a more rigid way initially, even in private.
It does seem that way.
Yeah.
Now shift the scenario to the public setting show and tell at school. Predictably, in both countries, people were generally less likely to endorse the atypical choice in public compared to private.
Sure, pressure to conform is real.
Ah,
Makes sense.
right. And again, the younger children in both countries were less likely to endorse the atypical public choice than young adults were. But here's the core insight I think that really stuck out from this study. The difference in endorsement between the private and public settings was significantly larger in Korea than in the US.
Huh. What does that tell us? What's the interpretation?
Well, the researchers propose that stronger public pressure to conform in Korea might actually lead individuals to place a greater emphasis on defending and accepting personal choices within private spaces. It's like a
I
counterbalance.
know, man.
In the US, where gender norms might be, less rigid overall, there's less need for such a stark distinction between private and public expression.
Fascinating. So the public constraint in Korea seems to highlight the value of private freedom more. That's really interesting. The study also noted this private-public difference was larger for boy protagonists than girl protagonists in the stories.
Yeah, another layer there. And when looking at why people gave these judgments their justifications, personal preference was the most common reason for endorsing the atypical choice, especially in private. This was used almost exclusively in Korea. In the US, particularly by the younger kids, justifications were more likely to reference gender norms, even for private choices.
So different reasoning even when the outcome might look similar sometimes. What about in the public setting?
Still lots of personal preference justifications, but also concerns about the child being teased or embarrassed or, practical issues related to the activity in a school setting.
Right, the social consequences become more salient. Now, this finding is key for understanding how these norms fit into that social domain theory we talked about. What happens when an authority figure, like a teacher, tries to enforce gender norms?
This is crucial. In both cultures, participants overwhelmingly judge a teacher's rule enforcing gender norms, like saying boys can't bring princess things, as not okay.
So they didn't see authority as having legitimate power here over this kind of thing.
Exactly. This powerfully supports the idea that in this context, gender norms are not viewed as moral rules, where authority can't just make something wrong right. Instead, they're seen more as personal choices or maybe conventional matters where, in this specific scenario, authority stepping in is considered overreaching or illegitimate.
Got it. There was an age difference here too, right? I think I remember that.
Yes, good point. The 5-year-olds were somewhat more accepting of the teacher's role than the older participants, suggesting this understanding of authority limits develops over time.
Makes sense.
And an interesting detail. While both groups largely disapproved, U.S. male participants approved of the rule slightly more than Korean male participants did. Still mostly disapproval, but a slight difference.
And how did they think the child would feel if they couldn't do their preferred activity?
Most expected the child to feel sad or disappointed. Pretty universally.
Okay, so to tie this section together, the study suggests kids and adults in both the U.S. and Korea see gender atypical interests as mostly personal choices, not moral issues. But how acceptable it feels to express that choice is heavily influenced by the setting public versus private, and that distinction appears more pronounced in Korea.
Right. And importantly, people in both cultures largely believe authority figures shouldn't enforce these kinds of norms.
Let's shift gears now to look at how parents approach teaching social skills, drawing from a study focused on Korean mothers of preschoolers. This moves us beyond just norms to explicit socialization efforts.
Yeah, this research looked at mothers in Seoul, exploring their beliefs about teaching skills like sharing, controlling negative emotions, and helping others. It's set against a backdrop of cultural shifts in Korea, blending, traditional Confucian values, stressing group harmony with increasing modern individualism.
So what social skills did the mothers prioritize for their preschoolers? Was there a hierarchy?
It seems so. They rated controlling negative emotions as less important compared to sharing and helping others.
Interesting. And did the child's gender matter?
Absolutely. Mothers rated social behaviors as more important for girls than for boys. This highlights how persistent gender-specific expectations can be, even for very young children.
Wow. And the reasons they gave for why these skills were important. This next finding is, I think, crucial to understanding that cultural nuance.
Yes, this was particularly revealing. When discussing sharing and emotional control, mothers cited more moral reasons for girls and more developmental reasons for boys.
Okay, wait. So for girls, learning to share or manage frustration was framed as it's the right thing to do, like a moral imperative.
That's the interpretation the source puts forward. It suggests social skills are seen as more obligatory or compulsory for girls, deeply linked to moral expectations. For boys, it was framed more in terms of developmental readiness or stage something they would naturally grow into.
That's really striking.
It is, and it contrasts with some findings from studies with mothers in the US and China.
A really clear difference based on gender framing the same skill as a moral requirement for one child and a developmental milestone for another. Did they also look at how mothers thought these skills were acquired? Like the causes?
They did. Regarding causal attributions, mothers cited more external causes like the child's environment or parental training for skills like sharing and helping. The source connects this to the Confucian emphasis on the influence of the environment in shaping character.
All right.
Emotion control was seen as influenced by both internal and external factors. And linking back to gender, mothers of boys more often cited developmental readiness as the cause for skill acquisition, while mothers of girls cited moral reasons more. It kind of reinforces that connection between gender, perceived causes, and the importance of the skill.
So it all ties together. What about teaching strategies? What did they endorse?
Modeling was the most endorsed strategy across all skills and genders. The source notes this aligns with findings for European American mothers, but differs from Chinese mothers, suggesting maybe a blend of traditional Korean teaching methods and modern approaches like social cognitive theory.
Right, a mix. So this study gives us a window into how cultural values and changing societal expectations blend for Korean mothers, leading them to prioritize certain social skills differently based on gender, framing them with different rationales, moral versus developmental, and leaning on external factors like environment, and modeling in their beliefs about how kids learn these skills.
Exactly. A really rich picture.
This brings us nicely to the broader role adults play in nurturing moral and social development, drawing from our U.S.-based sources. One, from Harvard, makes it clear that traits like empathy and caring aren't just inherent. They absolutely require active cultivation by adults.
Absolutely. It doesn't just happen. And another source from Vanderbilt highlights specific social skill sharing, helping, self-control, empathy, conflict resolution, labeling them academic enablers.
Academic enablers. I like that term.
Yeah, they argue these are not just nice-to-have skills, but are fundamental for a child's success in relationships, academics, and ultimately their future work life. They enable everything else.
So what kind of practical guidance do these sources offer adults, whether parents or educators? What should we be doing?
A few core principles emerge. First, be a conscious moral role model. Adults need to live the values they want to teach. Model honesty, fairness, respect, and how to resolve conflicts peacefully.
Walk the talk, basically.
Pretty much. And importantly, model humility by admitting mistakes and showing you're always learning. Children are watching, they pick up on hypocrisy really fast.
Good point. What else?
Spend meaningful time together regularly, have real conversations that go beyond, how was school, create space for children to share their thoughts and feelings, asking open-ended questions that invite deeper reflection.
Encouraging perspective taking seems vital here, based on the other studies too.
It is huge. Help children step outside their own viewpoint and consider how others might feel, especially those who are vulnerable or different from them. Use stories, news events, or just everyday interactions to discuss different experiences and foster empathy.
And supporting them through real-life ethical challenges, not just hypotheticals.
Right. Guide them when they face dilemmas, help them think through consequences and consider what aligns with their values, support them in taking action against injustice or contributing to their community. The source notes that many incredibly effective anti-bullying programs, for example, were actually started by students themselves.
Wow.
Encourage doing with others collaborative action rather than just doing for them. Empower them.
And finally, helping kids navigate their emotions. That came up in the Korean study too.
Yes. Teach children that having feelings, even difficult ones like anger or frustration, is okay. But help them learn healthy ways of dealing with those feelings. Teach them strategies for calming down, like the stop breath count method mentioned in the sources, and practice these skills when they're calm so they can use them when they're actually upset.
Practice when calm. That's key. The Vanderbilt source also discusses a more formal approach in schools, right?
Yes, school-wide social skills instruction. This is a systematic approach where schools identify key skills, use assessments, choose a curriculum, and teach these skills explicitly and consistently across the school, often using techniques like role-playing.
So really embedding it.
Exactly. The goal is to integrate this into the school culture and existing lessons, seeing it as a foundational investment in student well-being and academic achievement.
So whether at home or school, adults play an absolutely critical, proactive role in cultivating these foundational social and ethical skills. It takes effort. Now let's circle back to Korea and look specifically at formal moral education within the school system, drawing on a source that examines its status there. The source highlights that oral education has a long history and a highly emphasized place in Korean schools that's required, uses government textbooks, taught for many years.
Right, it sounds quite robust on paper. But despite this long-standing emphasis, the source identifies several significant challenges. One is the curriculum itself, which can lack consistency and sometimes mixes traditional values with modern ones in ways that feel, well, contradictory.
Like valuing obedience to elders, but also teaching critical thinking and individual rights. That could be confusing.
Precisely. The source notes the content can also feel unclear in its identity, overlapping with other subjects, and the sequence of topics doesn't always seem aligned with students' developmental stages.
And the teaching methods. You mentioned modeling earlier, but in a large classroom.
Yeah, that's the issue. Ideally, it would be discussion-based, using methods like the Socratic approach to foster real reasoning. But in reality, factors like large class sizes, a lack of teachers specialized in moral education, and the need for easily testable content often force methods back to direct instruction and memorization.
Which isn't very effective for internalizing values.
Not really. It doesn't foster genuine moral reasoning.
That sounds like a major hurdle teaching about ethics in a way that doesn't allow for ethical discussion. But the source points to what they see as an even bigger problem.
Yes, they emphasize the powerful influence of the hidden curriculum. This refers to all the implicit messages students receive from the actual school environment that aren't part of the formal lesson plan.
Okay, like what?
Examples include students perceiving rules as unfair, witnessing cheating go unpunished, or seeing peers ridicule someone for being honest. The culture of the school itself.
Ah. So what the school does teaches a different lesson than what the school says in the moral education class.
Exactly. That's the argument. The source argues that the negative impact of this implicit hidden curriculum often overrides any positive effects of the formal moral education lessons.
Wow.
Their conclusion is that for formal moral education to be effective, it must connect more authentically with the real-life experiences and environments of students, both within the school and in their families and communities. It can't be this separate, abstract thing.
That's a powerful idea. The lived environment, the implicit norms, can be a far stronger teacher than the explicit lesson plan. Really makes you think.
It really does.
So let's recap what we've unpacked in this deep dive. We've seen how children, from a young age, begin to differentiate between moral rules, social conventions, and personal choices. It's not all just rules to them.
And how deeply culture and context influence this. The U.S.-Korea study showed how gender norms are largely seen as personal choices in both cultures, but the public versus private setting matters a lot, with that distinction potentially more pronounced in Korea due to societal pressures.
Right. And crucially, participants in both cultures generally rejected authority, having legitimate jurisdiction over these kinds of personal or conventional choices in that context.
We also saw, using the Korean mother study, how parental beliefs about teaching foundational social skills are shaped by cultural values and can lead to significant differences based on a child's gender framing skills as moral obligations for girls versus maybe developmental milestones for boys.
Yeah, that was striking.
And finally, while there are explicit efforts in both contexts, from U.S. guidance on ethical parenting and school social skills programs to Korea's formal moral education system, a major challenge, particularly highlighted in the Korean source, is the powerful counter-influence of the implicit environment, what's called the hidden curriculum, what kids see happening around them.
So what does all this mean for you, our listener? It's an invitation to reflect, really. Think about your own background and the environments you grew up in, your family, your school, your culture. How did those shape your understanding of what's an unbreakable rule, what's just a social expectation, and what's simply your own business?
Yeah, and consider the young people in your life. How might you consciously model and teach social and ethical skills? And be mindful not just of the explicit lessons you deliver, but the implicit messages they're absorbing from your actions and the environments you create or place them in. That hidden curriculum exists everywhere.
And here's a final provocative thought to leave you with. If the hidden curriculum in schools can be more powerful than the formal lessons, where else might powerful unspoken norms be operating in our lives, in our families, Our workplaces, online communities. How are these hidden curricula shaping behavior, perhaps in ways we don't even recognize? And what responsibility do we have not just to speak our values, but to identify and maybe try to influence those powerful implicit environments?
That's a great question to ponder. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.